Ladies and gentlemen, it's always very difficult playing second fiddle to the president of Kosovo and a prodigy violinist, so I'd appreciate if everyone's very gentle with me this morning. I'm Evan Kohlman. I work as a private outside investigator. I'm hired, of course, by the FBI and Scotland Yard and a variety of other law enforcement and intelligence agencies to investigate and understand the phenomenon of modern terrorism. And of course, you might be asking, why is there a terrorism researcher speaking at a conference of Amsterdam for women, TEDx for women? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But I'm here to talk about stereotypes. And most importantly, I'm here to talk about breaking stereotypes. And if we think about stereotypes in terrorism, the one stereotype that comes out, when we think about what an Al-Qaeda operative or an Al-Qaeda recruit looks like, what is the stereotype we think of? We think about an angry, young, bearded man. That is the stereotype. In the US, we call that the 9/11 hijacker profile. And I'm here to tell you today that those of us who are actually practitioners, not of terrorism, but of counterterrorism, we are seeing a different type of phenomenon coming up. And we're seeing that that profile and that stereotype no longer applies. And it is very important for us to understand how it is changing and why it is changing so that we have a better handle on radicalization and terrorism as a whole. And here I'm talking very specifically about women. Just this week, a young Saudi woman on Twitter announced that she had arrived in Syria. She had arrived in Syria to fight in a violent holy war, to fight in jihad. She asked people on Twitter to pray that she could become a suicide bomber. Now, this is a woman who is the wife of a well-known jihadi scholar in Saudi Arabia. She's the sister of someone who's already fighting in Syria. And she's from Saudi Arabia. This is a country that does not even permit women to drive. Yet she had gotten all the way to Syria with the blessing of her family, with the blessing of her husband, and she was going there to fight, just like dozens, hundreds of other men have done. And unfortunately, Ukht Julaibib, this young Saudi woman, she's not alone. And it's not just women from Saudi Arabia. It's not just women from Palestine or from Egypt. It's women from all around the world. And it's a very interesting series of vignettes. And I think rather than in the short time I have here trying to provide you with all the answers, which I can't possibly do, I'm going to give you just enough information to make you dangerous. Just enough information for you to start asking the right questions, the questions that we have not been asking heretofore, and will help us to lead us to a better understanding of what is really driving people to join these organizations, to take up a violent cause, particularly transnational jihad. And the best way of understanding it is by looking at the people who have joined into this, the women who have joined into this, and understand how they are different and how they are also similar. And so I will begin my vignettes with perhaps the most well-known female contemporary terrorist or suspected terrorist, a young woman from the United Kingdom, originally born in Ireland, by the name of Samantha Luthwaite. Samantha is a bit of celebrity now. In the last few months, she became famous after the attack on the Westgate Mall in Kenya. Samantha is actually currently the subject of an Interpol Red Notice. In other words, she is a top priority. She is considered to be a violent threat. She is sought right now in Kenya for possessing explosives, for conspiring to murder people. In fact, she is known there as the quote-unquote White Widow, because she is not merely an operative within the terrorist group Al-Shabaab, she is a ringleader. She is an organizer. She is feared by the men under her command. They respect and they fear her. And where do they get this respect and fear from? For a young woman who was from the UK, who had never been to Africa before. Well, she isn't just any woman. She is the widow of Jermaine Lindsay, a suicide bomber who blew himself up in July of 2005 in London. And because of that, Samantha has become famous. She's become infamous. She's become a hero, an icon within the jihadi world. Even within the jihadi world that is so hostile, from the outside anyway, to women. To her right, Roshanara Chowdhury, a 15-year-old girl from the United Kingdom who had spent way too much time on the internet studying sermons by radical clerics. This is not a girl that ever went to a training camp. She never went to an Al-Qaeda training camp. She never met anyone in a terrorist group, but just listening to sermons online. By the age of 21, she went out and stabbed and attempted to kill a British member of parliament. She later told police that if someone had not intervened, she would have kept stabbing him and stabbing him and stabbing him until she could not do any more. To her right, we've talked about the white widow. Well, here's the black widow, Malika Al-Aroud of Belgium. She's known as the Black Widow because of the fact that she has a habit for marrying men and then convincing them to become suicide operatives. Her first husband died as a suicide bomber in September of 2001. His act, his bombing, predicated the 9/11 attacks in the United States by taking out Osama bin Laden's main adversary in Afghanistan. Her second husband was killed last year. He was teaching Europeans how to join Al-Qaeda. He was out on the Afghan-Pakistani border. He was teaching these people to come back here and kill people right here in Europe. Ms. Aroud herself has been convicted in Belgium in 2010 on terrorism charges. And you'll see the middle there on the left, Muriel de Gook, another individual from Belgium, a 38-year-old convert to Islam who in November of 2005 blew herself up in a suicide car bombing in Baghdad, targeting U.S. forces there. Her husband was also there. Her husband also tried carrying out a bombing and failed. Saima Mohammed, to her right, a 15-year-old girl from Toronto, Canada. The sister-in-law of Fahim Ahmad, one of the Toronto 18. This was a cell that was picked up in Toronto that was trying to carry out a variety of different terrorist attacks, beheading the head of the Canadian Parliament live in Parliament. That was their idea. Saima, listening to all this, came up with her own ideas. She met an 18-year-old recruiter for Al-Qaeda on the internet, and she told him, after marrying him, that if you tell me to drive a truck full of explosives into a military base, I will do it, at age 15. To her right, Nicole Mansfield, 33-year-old woman from Flint, Michigan, with no ties to the Middle East, no ties to Syria, no knowledge of the region. Yet she was killed there in May of this year, fighting against the Syrian government. She was killed while fighting alongside Syrian Islamist forces. When the Syrian security forces went into the vehicle she was in and began searching, they found an Al-Qaeda banner, and they found the bodies of other foreign fighters fighting with Al-Qaeda in Syria. To her right, Dr. Afia Siddiqui, one of the most puzzling vignettes that I will discuss today. A woman who in 2001 earned a PhD in neuroscience from Brandeis University in the United States. This was a woman with incredible promise, incredibly talented, incredibly smart, well-respected, and yet something very dramatic happened to her between 2001 and 2003. We really don't know the full extent of her change, of her evolution. But by 2005, she had reportedly anyway, married the mastermind behind 9/11. She was working with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Supposedly, she was heading up a chem bioweapons program on their behalf. In 2008, she was arrested in Afghanistan. She was captured while in the possession of bomb-making chemicals and bomb-making instructions. When U.S. soldiers tried taking her into custody, she fought them. She grabbed one of their weapons and began trying to shoot the soldiers who were taking her into custody. And I can tell you right now that every time Al-Qaeda in Pakistan or the Pakistani Taliban carry out an operation, they say it is in honor of Dr. Afia Siddiqui. They demand the freedom of Dr. Afia Siddiqui. In fact, that was the #1 demand the Pakistani Taliban had when they attempted to bomb Times Square in New York in 2010. She is a cause célèbre. She is an icon. She is a hero for these people. Whether or not she is a woman, that is irrelevant. On the bottom left, you see Jamie Ramirez and Colleen LaRose. Colleen LaRose had the other unfortunate nickname. We've talked about the Black Widow. We've talked about the White Widow. Colleen LaRose was known as Jihad Jane. I didn't make these nicknames up. She gained this nickname because she went on the internet and was desperate to find a jihadi recruiter, someone who would take her to an al-Qaeda camp in Afghanistan or Pakistan. In 2008, she became so desperate, she traveled here to Europe with two missions in mind. Either she would meet someone who would take her to a training camp and learn how to become a terrorist, or she was going to kill the Swedish cartoonist Lars Vilks. The cartoonist, of course, who drew these cartoons that are considered very blasphemous to many Muslims. At one point, she was here in the Netherlands, and she wrote an email to her comrades, and she said, "I'm so excited because I'm so close to my enemy. I'm so close to Lars Vilks right now. I can sense it." Her left, Jamie Ramirez, one of her partners in crime, Jamie actually took her infant son with her abroad to Ireland and was going to then take him to a Taliban training camp. The fact that he was an infant, the fact that he knew nothing of what was going on, the fact that he was an innocent pawn in this, it didn't mean anything to her. To her right, you see a woman holding an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade. She's known simply as Osman. She's a woman. She's a suicide bomber. And she's being actively promoted by a very prominent terrorist group known as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. They actually released this video just a few months ago announcing the fact that a major suicide bombing attack that they had carried out in Quetta was not carried out by a man, but was carried out by a woman. And they featured Osman in this video. They showed her firing weapons. They showed her reading a martyrdom will. They had the leader of the organization come out and praise her and talk about how wonderful she was, just like we used to see with men. But now it's not just men. And of course, finally on the far right, Sajida al-Rishawi. Sajida al-Rishawi, as you can probably see from the photo, was a failed suicide bomber. In November, again in 2005, she attempted to carry out a bombing of a hotel in Amman, Jordan. She was the wife of an al-Qaeda operative and the sister of another al-Qaeda operative. And they sent her to carry out this mission because they trusted her and they believed she could do it. Does this mean that every terrorist that we're seeing now is a woman? No. The vast proportion, the majority are still men. But what this shows us is that by relying on certain stereotypes, by seeing every angry bearded man as being a terrorist and excluding everyone else is not going to work for us in the future. This very patriarchal view of jihad and a violent jihad simply does not hold up anymore. And while women still are struggling for their rights in many parts of the Muslim world, we should understand that these jihadi groups, these terrorist groups, have taken an oddly liberated view of this. And so when we're at an airport and we're at a border or we're looking for someone who's a potential suicide bomber, no longer can it be simply us looking for that bearded young man. We have to conceive now that it is just as likely to be a bearded young man as it is Jamie Ramirez or Colleen LaRose or Saima Mohammed. These are the women who provide some of the most important answers that we can find about what is driving people to join terrorist groups. It is not simply because they are young men. It is because of something else. It is because of something more fundamental. And these women have the answers. Thank you very much.